Since I was little, I've always had a very vivid imagination. My mind created monsters under the bed and sinister shadows in the corners of the room. But as I grew older, these ghostly figures became less frequent, and I learned to distinguish reality from imagination. Or so I thought. My name is Nick, and everything changed when I turned 8 years old. My parents decided I was ready to have my own room. At first, I was excited about the idea. Finally, I would have my own space, away from the noise and mess of my younger siblings. But as the moving date approached, a sense of apprehension started to settle in. The night before the move, I was lying in bed in the room I shared with my little brother when I heard a strange noise coming from the hallway. It sounded like something was crawling on the walls. I froze, afraid to move or make any sound that might attract whatever was out there. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to my brother, who was lying next to me. "What?" He yawned sleepily. "I didn't hear anything." I sighed, convincing myself that it must be just the house creaking. But as I turned to try and sleep, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as if someone was watching me. I looked around, but the room was immersed in darkness, with only the faint moonlight coming through the window. "Good night, Nick," said my brother, turning to the other side. "Good night," I replied, though I knew sleep would elude me that night. The next day, I woke up to the sound of boxes being carried and furniture being moved. The move was in full swing. My parents were busy supervising everything, while my siblings ran around the house, excited about exploring the new neighborhood. "Come on, Nick, help carry your things," my dad called from the hallway. I reluctantly got up and started packing my things. I looked around the room that had been my refuge for so many years and felt a twinge of sadness. But at the same time, a sense of relief was also present. Maybe, in my new room, I could finally leave behind the fears of my childhood. My new room was small but cozy. It had a window that looked out onto the backyard, letting in plenty of light during the day. At night, the shadows took on shapes on the walls, creating ghostly figures that reminded me of my childhood fears. On the first night in my new room, I felt strangely alone. The house still smelled of boxes and fresh paint, and the silence was oppressive. I lay in bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin, and tried to convince myself that I was being silly. It was just a room. There was nothing scary about it, but as the night progressed, I started to hear strange sounds. First, it was a low creak, as if someone was walking on the wooden floor of the hallway. Then, I heard a whisper, as if someone was speaking softly outside my door. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and listened intently. But as soon as I moved, the sounds ceased. "You must be imagining things, Nick," I told myself. "Go to sleep." But sleep wouldn't come. I lay there, listening to every little noise in the house, until I finally dozed off. That night, I had a disturbing dream. I was lying in my bed, paralyzed, while a dark figure approached. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze fixed on me. A voice whispered in my ear, saying things I couldn't understand, but that filled me with deep fear. I woke up breathless and drenched in cold sweat. The full moon shone through the window, illuminating the room. I looked around, relieved to realize it had just been a dream. But then I heard a noise in the corner of the room. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling. There was no answer, only silence. I got up from the bed, my heart pounding, and cautiously walked towards the corner. That's when I saw on the floor a crumpled piece of paper. I bent down to pick it up, feeling a chill run down my spine. With trembling fingers, I unfolded the paper and saw, written in capital letters, a single word: "Run." The next morning, I woke up confused and disoriented. The sun shone through the window, and I felt momentarily relieved to have survived that terrifying night. But then, I remembered the paper and the enigmatic warning. Run. But from whom? From what? I got up from the bed, feeling the weight of the previous night on my shoulders. I walked to the bedroom door and cautiously opened it, half expecting to find someone on the other side. But the corridor was deserted, with only the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. "Good morning, Nick," my mother called from the kitchen. "Come have breakfast." "Coming," I shouted back, still a bit dazed. As I walked through the house, I felt watched. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see a dark figure approaching, but there was nothing, just the empty house. I sat down at the kitchen table, where my dad was reading the newspaper and my mom was making pancakes. "Did you sleep well in your new room?" my mom asked, placing a plate of pancakes in front of me. "Sort of," I replied hesitantly, reluctant to share my supernatural experiences. I heard some strange noises, but it must have been just the house settling. My dad looked up from the newspaper. "Yeah, old houses make strange noises, but if you hear anything concerning, let us know." I nodded, digging into my breakfast, but as I ate, I couldn't shake the thought of the paper and the feeling that something sinister was going on. Later that day, while unpacking boxes, I came across an old photo album. I flipped through the pages, looking at pictures from my childhood. Then, one particular photo caught my attention. It was a picture of me, at around 5 years old, lying in bed with a scared look on my face, as if I had seen a ghost. "What did you find there?" My older sister, Diana, looked over my shoulder. "Oh, just an old photo," I replied, quickly closing the album, but Diana had already seen it. "Wow, you look terrified. What happened?" I hesitated for a moment, struggling with the urge to share my fears. "I had a nightmare," I murmured, "but it was a long time ago." Diana smiled, but her eyes were full of compassion. "Well, I hope you don't have any more nightmares now that you're in your new room." I smiled back, but my heart was heavy. I knew that night had only been the beginning. Something sinister was happening, and I needed to figure out what it was before it was too late. As the days turned into weeks, my daily routine became increasingly familiar. During the day, I helped my parents with chores, explored the new neighborhood with my siblings, and tried to ignore the constant feeling that something was wrong. But at night, when the sun set and darkness enveloped the house, my fear returned with full force. Every night I fell asleep with the light on, afraid of what might happen if I let the darkness take over my room. And every morning I woke up with a distinct feeling that something or someone had been watching me while I slept. One night, after weeks of disturbed sleep, I decided to face my fears once and for all. I turned off the light and forced myself to lie in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the house around me. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed amplified, each small noise making my heart race. And just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard a noise in the corner of the room. It sounded like something was walking inside the walls. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and looked towards the sound. That's when I saw her. A tall, slender figure dressed in black was standing in the corner of the room, watching me. Her face was in shadow, but her eyes shone with a sinister light. I felt a chill run down my spine, and a deep fear settled within me. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, but I could feel her presence filling the room. My heart raced even faster, and a cold sweat broke out on my spine. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice failing. The figure took a step forward, and for the first time I could see what was hidden in the shadows. Her face was a mask of terror, with empty eyes and a mouth twisted into an evil smile. I screamed, shrinking back into the bed, and the figure disappeared as if she had never existed. I sat there, trembling until my parents rushed into the room, alarmed by my scream. "Nick, what happened?" My mom hugged me while my dad turned on the light. I saw something," I stammered, still shaking. Something was here in the room. My parents looked at me with concern, but also with skepticism. "You must have had a nightmare," my mom said, stroking my hair. "Try to sleep now. Tomorrow is another day." I nodded, knowing they wouldn't believe me, but as I lay down looking at the corner of the room where the figure had appeared, I knew it hadn't been a dream. Something sinister was happening, and I needed to figure it out before it was too late. The years passed, and I grew into an adult, but the events of that haunted night still lingered in my memory. I moved out of my childhood home, went to college, started a career, got married, and had children. Yet, the darkness of the night sometimes brought flashbacks of the past. My heart would race, and I would feel the same sense of being watched. As I aged, I learned to cope with my fear. I understood that my childhood room wasn't cursed, nor was the house haunted. The problem was Memmy hyperactive imagination, my childish fears, and my tendency to see the supernatural where it didn't exist. However, the darkness of the night still brought a sense of apprehension. Sometimes I would catch myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if there was something lurking in the shadows. My children laughed at my ghost stories and hauntings, thinking I was making it all up. But I knew there was something more, something I couldn't explain. My interests changed over the years, and I became fascinated by the supernatural. I devoured books and documentaries about paranormal phenomena, and I became an active member of online forums where people shared their own inexplicable experiences. And as I learned more about the supernatural world, I realized I wasn't alone. There were others out there who had experienced similar things, people who had also seen dark figures, heard whispering voices, and felt the presence of the other world. I continued my search for answers over the years, a quest to understand what had happened that haunted night in my childhood. And although I never found definitive answers, I learned to accept the unknown and live with the mystery. My fear became a part of me, a constant reminder that there are more things between heaven and earth than we can explain. And at night, when the darkness envelops me once more, I smile, remembering that sometimes reality is far scarier than any ghost story. It was a night like any other. My name is Zach, and I was in my workshop working on some comic book art when my friend Neil dropped by. Neil and I had been friends for years, sharing a love for comic books and all things supernatural. He often kept me company while I worked. "What do you think of this?" Neil asked, placing a pizza box on the table. "Just picked it up, still hot." I thanked him and took a slice. As I ate, I continued working on a particularly tricky panel. Something about the pizza tasted a little off, but I couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. "Dude, you won't believe what happened to me today," Neil said, his face lit with excitement. "You know how I love exploring abandoned places, right? So today, I ventured into an old sanitarium outside of town." Neil went on to recount his adventure, describing the decaying corridors and empty rooms of the sanitarium, but something about his demeanor seemed off. His eyes were a bit glassy, and his voice sounded somewhat mechanical. "And guess what I found there?" he asked, his voice taking on a strange, sharp edge. "There were some old medical records, and one of them mentioned a patient named Zalgo. The way he was described, it was as if he were some sort of supernatural entity." A growing sense of unease settled over me. The pizza wasn't sitting well in my stomach, and Neil's account of the sanitarium left me uneasy. "Neil, you seem a bit different," I said, setting the pizza aside. "Are you sure you're okay?" He gave me a vacant stare, his eyes seeming to bore into my soul. Then, he smiled, but there was something sinister in that smile. "Of course, I just got a little fascinated with the story of Zalgo, that's all. But let's get back to what you were doing." I nodded, though a voice in my head told me to stay alert. I continued working on the comic, but I couldn't fully concentrate. Something about the night felt out of the ordinary. As the night progressed, the comic book art I was working on began to take shape. The story revolved around a detective investigating a series of mysterious disappearances. However, the more I drew, the more the images seemed distorted. "Dude, these panels are getting dark," Neil commented, looking over my shoulder, "especially this one. It looks like those tentacles are moving." I looked at the panel I was working on. He was right. The tentacles, which had started as simple sketches, now appeared to be writhing on the page as if they were alive. A sense of unease settled in my stomach. "I think I need some air," I said, setting down my drawing pen. "I'll be right back." I stepped out of my workshop, breathing in the fresh night air. The moon was full and shone brightly, casting an eerie light on the world. I walked a bit, trying to calm my troubled mind. That's when I heard the sound of a motorcycle approaching. A biker rode past me, his eyes passing over me like two empty black holes. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickened my steps back to the workshop. "Where'd you go?" Neil asked when I returned. "Everything okay?" I shook my head. trying to shake off the image of the biker's eyes. Just needed some fresh air. These stories of sanitariums and supernatural entities are getting to me. Neil smiled, but there was something sinister in his smile. You should hear some more. I've got some bone-chilling true stories to tell. I think I've had enough horror stories for one day, I replied, trying to make a joke. But as the night wore on, the stories Neil told grew darker and more disturbing. My stomach churned from the pizza that now clearly seemed spoiled, and the images in my comic seemed increasingly corrupted. The night turned into a race against time as events took an even more sinister turn. My wife, Kate, who was pregnant, went into labor. We rushed to the hospital, leaving Neil behind, still spinning his dark tales. The hospital felt like a place out of the ordinary, with its bright lights and empty corridors. Kate was taken to the delivery room, and I stayed by her side, holding her hand. "You're going to be okay?" I whispered to her, as much to calm myself as to reassure her. A nurse entered, her eyes appearing strangely vacant in the fluorescent light. She checked Kate's vital signs and made some notes on her chart. "The baby's almost here," she said, her voice sounding oddly distant. "The doctor will be here shortly." The minutes dragged on as we waited. Kate squeezed my hand tightly, her face contorted in pain. I looked at her, my eyes drifting over her familiar features, and that's when I saw it. Her eyes, once brown, now appeared pitch black and empty, like dark holes in her head. A scream escaped my throat. I let go of her hand and backed away, my heart pounding. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice filled with panic. "What's happening?" "Your eyes," I murmured, pointing at them. "There." The nurse approached, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Sir, you need to calm down. It's normal for eyes to appear different during labor. The pressure can make the veins more visible." Her words did not comfort me. Something was very wrong. I could feel it in my bones. The doctor entered the room, his white coat splattered with blood. He smiled at us, but his eyes too seemed empty, like windows into the darkness. "All right, Mom," he said, his voice oddly cheerful. "Let's meet this baby." The baby cried when it was born, a sound that would normally be music to my ears. But as the doctor handed the baby to Kate, I saw that its eyes were completely black, like tiny bottomless pits. My heart hammered in my chest as I looked at the baby in Kate's arms. The delivery room seemed like a sinister, distorted place, with the figures around me resembling creatures from a nightmare more than humans. "What happened to him?" I whispered, pointing to the baby's eyes. "Why are they black?" The doctor and nurse exchanged a glance, their faces impassive. "Sometimes, babies' eyes can appear black right after birth," the doctor said, his voice oddly calm. "It's just a temporary ocular anomaly." But I couldn't convince myself. Something sinister was at play, and I was certain it was connected to the entity Neil had mentioned, Zalgo. "We have to get out of here," I murmured to Kate, moving closer to her. "Something's not right." She looked at me, her eyes now returning to their familiar brown. "What do you mean? What's going on?" "I can't explain it, but I feel like we're in danger," I said, picking up our older daughter, Diana, who was sitting by the bed, scared by the commotion. "Just trust me, and let's get out of here." We rushed out of the hospital, ignoring the protests of the medical staff. The baby cried in my arms, and Diana ran alongside us, her big eyes filled with fear. We got into the car and drove off, heading in the opposite direction of our home. "What's happening?" Kate asked, her voice filled with fear. "Why are we running?" "Neil mentioned an entity called Zalgo," I said, turning the car toward my parents' house. "I think he's connected to this somehow. Everyone we encountered today seemed possessed." Kate let out a moan, covering her mouth with her hand. "What are we going to do?" "We're going to my parents' place," I said, turning the car toward the remote location. "They live out of town, in a secluded area. It'll be harder for this thing to find us there." The drive was filled with tense silence, interrupted only by the occasional cry of the baby. I glanced in the rearview mirror several times, wondering if black eyes were watching us from the shadows. We arrived at my parents' house and rushed inside, locking the door behind us. I sighed in relief. "I think we're safe for now," I said, hugging Kate and the kids. But even as I spoke, a sense of unease lingered in my mind. The image of the black eyes haunted me, and I wondered if we would ever truly be safe from Zalgo. It was a chilly Saturday night, around 9 p.m. My name is Walker, and I was walking alone through the streets of Manhattan, heading home after a long day at work. The cold breeze cut through my face, and my footsteps echoed on the deserted sidewalks. It seemed like any other night. I had left the office a bit later than usual, so the streets were empty, with only a few cars passing by occasionally. As I walked with my hands in the pockets of my coat, a sense of being watched crept over me. I looked around, but the streets were deserted. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the paranoia, and continued on my way. It didn't take long for me to reach my apartment building. As I stepped inside, I took off my coat and hung it on the rack by the door. That's when I noticed something inside the pocket. I felt the soft fabric of what seemed to be a black hoodie, folded meticulously. How had it gotten there? I unfolded the hoodie and examined it more closely. It was plain black, with no logo or design. It had a hood, which set it apart from regular sweatshirts. I tried it on and was surprised at how well it fit. The fabric was incredibly soft and cozy, as if it had been tailor-made for me. I couldn't recall where the hoodie had come from. Initially, I thought about throwing it away, assuming it belonged to someone in my building. But then, something inside me made me want to keep it. It was as if a voice in my head convinced me that I needed this piece of clothing. I couldn't explain the connection I felt with this hoodie. It seemed silly to think that a simple piece of clothing could have any sort of power over me. But it was as if it awakened something within me. In the following days, I found myself wearing the hoodie more and more. I felt a growing confidence, a boldness I had never experienced before. The hood gave me a sense of anonymity, as if I could hide from the world while observing everything around me. I started wearing it when I went out at night, walking through the deserted streets, feeling a sense of power I had never known before. My friends noticed the change. "Dude, you're different," Mark said during our poker game. "What happened? You seem more intense." I smiled evasively. How could I explain the influence of a simple hoodie? Something told me they wouldn't understand. One day, while wearing the hoodie, I got into an argument with a man who bumped into me. Instead of apologizing, I felt a surge of overwhelming anger. Before I knew it, I pushed him with such force that he fell to the ground. I was shocked at my own reaction. The man got up, enraged, and glared at me. "What the hell was that, man?" he shouted. "I'm sorry," I muttered, feeling a mix of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to walk away, while another part wanted to continue the confrontation. This wasn't a normal reaction for me, and I knew it. I was intrigued and, at the same time, scared of the intensity of my own aggression. In the following days, I found myself reflecting on that incident, trying to understand what had happened. That's when I started to notice other changes in myself. My thoughts seemed darker, more intense. I felt a growing disregard for the consequences of my actions, as if the normal rules of society didn't apply to me. The hoodie had become a sort of armor, giving me a sense of invincibility. One night, I went for a walk, wearing the hood to shield myself from the light rain that was falling. As I walked through the dark streets, I felt an irresistible urge. I saw a solitary figure ahead, a man walking towards his car. Without thinking twice, I followed my impulse and attacked. I opened the car door, pulled the man out. The feeling of power was indescribable. The man pleaded for mercy, dazed, begging me to stop, but I couldn't. It was only when I heard the sound of approaching footsteps that I snapped out of it and ran away. I ran through the streets, breathless, my heart pounding. What had I done? I felt a mix of conflicting emotions: excitement, fear, and confusion. I hid in an alley, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what had happened. The following days were filled with constant anguish. I knew what I had done was wrong. The hoodie, once a comfort, had now become the tangible symbol of the darkness within me. I decided I had to get rid of it. I put it in a bag and walked to a nearby river. I stood at the water's edge, hesitant. "What are you doing, Walker?" I asked myself. "You can't just throw it away." My heart was heavy as I looked at the black fabric, now crumpled inside the bag. I felt a reluctance to part with it, as if we were somehow connected, but I knew it had to be done. I threw the bag into the river, watching it float briefly before sinking into the dark waters. I felt a weight being lifted from my shoulders, but also a void. It was as if I had separated myself from a part of me that I didn't understand and feared. In the days that followed, I reflected on my experiences. I spoke with a therapist, trying to understand the source of my repressed aggression. Gradually, I began to accept that there were dark aspects to my personality, which the hoodie had amplified and brought to the surface. Over time, I learned to manage these impulses and to understand that they didn't define me. That hoodie became a reminder that we all have dark sides, but we are responsible for our actions and for seeking help when needed. It was a cold and gloomy Sunday night, straight out of a horror story, with crackling fireplaces and shadows dancing to the sound of the howling wind. This atmosphere fascinated me, but it also stirred a deep fear within me. My name is Ezekiel, an unusual name inherited from my grandfather, and from an early age, I was haunted by horrifying nightmares. Shadow creatures with sharp claws and gleaming eyes relentlessly pursued me. My mother, witnessing my constant terror, decided to take action to comfort me. "Ezekiel, my dear, I have something special for you." Her voice sounded gentle and full of promise one night as she entered my room with an excited gleam in her eyes. In the palms of her hands she held a cloth monster with expressive eyes and a wide mouth full of pointed teeth. "This is your new friend, Ikbar Beaglesteiner," she explained, handing him to me. "He's here to keep you safe from the creatures of darkness that haunt you." I was intrigued by the peculiar doll, its mischievous smile and unique appearance. Instantly, I felt braver with him by my side. "Thank you so much, Mom." I expressed my gratitude, hugging the doll tightly. "I'll take good care of him, and together we'll face my fears." That night, I fell asleep quickly, feeling protected with Ikbar by my side. To my surprise, I wasn't tormented by any nightmares. I woke up renewed and grateful for the presence of my cloth guardian. I took Ikbar with me wherever I went, and he became my constant companion. People looked at us with curiosity and perhaps even a bit of envy, as Ikbar was truly one of a kind. As the days turned into weeks, I began to notice something unusual. At night, as the moon shone through my bedroom window, Ikbar seemed to take on a slightly different appearance. His eyes seemed to glow with a light of their own, and his pointed teeth looked even more menacing. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and find him sitting in a corner of the room, his eyes fixed on me with an indecipherable expression. The relationship between Ikbar and me deepened, shrouded in an air of mystery. One night, I suddenly awoke, sensing an enigmatic presence in my room. My heart pounding, I looked around, feeling that something was amiss. Ikbar, my faithful guardian, was not in his usual spot next to my bed. Then my eyes fell upon a hooded figure silently sitting by the window. "Who are you?" My voice sounded hesitant as I sat up in bed, staring at the enigmatic figure. The figure rose gracefully, revealing a tall and slender silhouette. "I am the reason the shadow creatures no longer disturb your sleep, Ezekiel," a deep, reverberating voice said. "I am the guardian of your peaceful nights, protecting you from the nightmares that haunted you." I stood frozen, unable to articulate any words. The figure approached, its eyes shining beneath the hood. "I am the embodiment of your fear, but also of your courage," the figure continued. "And now, it's time to seal a pact." My mind was confused, trying to comprehend the unusual situation. "A pact?" I stammered, uncertain about what was happening. The figure extended its hand, revealing a small wooden box adorned with intricate symbols. "Ikbar needs sustenance to continue protecting you," the figure explained. "And that sustenance is the toys of other children. He needs the joy and innocence they contain." I was shocked by the unusual request. "Toys from other children?" I questioned, incredulous. "But that's not right. How can I take their toys away?" The figure let out a low, mysterious laugh. "You will do what is necessary to maintain peace in your nights, Ezekiel. Ikbar is the key to your tranquility, and he must be fed. It's a small sacrifice to keep the nightmares at bay." I hesitated, struggling with the idea of taking away something that brought joy to other children. But then I remembered the terror I felt before Ikbar came into my life. What do I need to do? I asked, my voice carrying a mix of curiosity and reluctance. The figure explained that I should obtain the toys in some way, whether through trades, purchases, or even findings. But remember, the figure warned, if you reveal anything about me or about Ikbar to anyone, the pact will be broken, and the consequences will be unpredictable. I slowly nodded, feeling the weight of the pact on my shoulders. I'll do what I can to keep Ikbar satisfied. I agreed, aware of the responsibility I now carried. The figure turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone with my tangled thoughts. I knew I had made an unusual pact, but I also knew that Ikbar's presence was essential to keep the shadows of fear at bay. The next day, I woke up with a sense of determination. I knew I had to fulfill my part of the pact to keep Ikbar content and ensure the nightmares didn't return, so I began to devise a plan to obtain toys from other children. I spent the following days observing children playing in the park, trying to identify which toys they cherished the most. My heart was heavy, as I didn't want to take away their joy, but I was constantly reminded of my purpose. One afternoon, while watching a boy playing with a race car, I had an idea. I approached him and started a conversation, praising the toy and expressing how much my younger cousin would love to have a car like that. To my surprise, the boy was thrilled with the idea of trading the car for a deck of cards I had brought with me. I was relieved that I didn't have to take the toy by force, and the boy seemed genuinely happy with the exchange. I returned home with the race car in my backpack, feeling a mix of conflicting emotions. That night, when the moon was high in the sky, I went to the room where Ikbar stayed. I placed the toy in the wooden box the mysterious figure had left, and carefully closed the lid. Ikbar seemed livelier than ever, his eyes glowing with an odd light. "You've done well, Ezekiel," Ikbar said, his voice sounding deeper than I remembered. "The joy and innocence contained in this toy will give me strength to continue protecting you." I shuddered at Ikbar's words, realizing that our pact was real and carried consequences. In the following days, I continued to collect toys from other children, always ensuring a fair trade. But as time passed, I began to notice something strange. The children whose toys I had taken seemed sadder and more withdrawn. Some even fell ill, and I couldn't help but wonder if there was a connection to the toys I had taken from them. My heart grew heavy with the possibility that I was causing them suffering. Troubled by the impact my actions were having on the other children, I decided to confront Ikbar. One night when the moon was full and bright, I called upon him in my room. "Ikbar, I need to understand," I began, my voice trembling. "Why are the other children sad and sick? Does it have something to do with the toys I took from them?" Ikbar materialized before me, his eyes glowing with an enigmatic light. "You made a pact, Ezekiel," he said, his voice sounding like a whisper in the wind. "The joy and innocence contained in those toys are my sustenance, but they also bring consequences for those who lost them." I was shocked by the revelation, but I just wanted to get rid of the nightmares, I murmured, feeling guilty. I didn't want to hurt anyone. Ikbar moved closer, his presence filling the room. "You must understand, Ezekiel, that actions have consequences," he said. "The joy was taken from them, and it affected their vitality. But know that, at the same time, you strengthened me to keep you safe." I felt a lump in my throat, realizing the true cost of our pact. "So, what should I do now?" I asked, desperate for a solution. "I don't want to see anyone suffering because of me." Ikbar hesitated, his expression turning somber. "You must decide, Ezekiel," he said. "You can choose to undo the pact, but know that the consequences may be terrible. The nightmares may return, and the shadow creatures may find their way back into your mind." I stood paralyzed, struggling with the difficult decision that needed to be made. On one hand, I didn't want to cause more suffering to anyone, but on the other hand, the fear of the nightmares and shadow creatures haunted me. I spent the next few nights in agony, debating internally about what to do, until, finally, I made a decision. I called upon Ikbar once more. and with a heavy heart I told him that I wanted to undo the pact. "I can't continue causing suffering to other children," I declared, my voice firm, "even if it means facing my fears again." Ikbar looked at me with an indecipherable expression. "So be it," he said, "but remember, the consequences will be yours to bear." That night I returned the toys to the children, explaining what I had done and asking for forgiveness. They were happy to have their toys back, but also confused by my actions. In the following days, I felt inner peace for having done the right thing, but at night, when darkness fell, the nightmares returned with full force. The shadow creatures crawled back into my mind, and I woke up drenched in sweat and terror. However, over time, I realized that I was facing my fears. The nightmares still came, but I was learning to confront them, and eventually, the shadow creatures began to disappear, one by one. It was a dark and stormy night, and I, John, was sitting in front of the fireplace in my family's wooden cabin, located deep within a secluded forest. The flames danced, casting eerie shadows on the walls, while the wind howled around the cabin, making the trees creak and groan. My family had inherited this long-forgotten cabin from a distant relative, and we were spending an extended weekend exploring the area. This particular day had been rainy and gray, keeping us from enjoying the outdoors. Instead, we spent the day playing board games and telling stories around the fireplace. Now, at night, the storm had subsided, but the atmosphere remained gloomy and unnerving. As I watched the flames dance, my mind returned to the scary stories my older sister Sarah had told earlier. Her words still echoed, bringing a growing sense of unease. She had spoken in detail about local legends, especially one about a mysterious creature known as the Wanderer. According to Sarah, this sinister figure, tall and slender, with a pale face and deep-set eyes, roamed the forest on stormy nights, seeking lost travelers or unsuspecting children. It was said that he could hypnotize his victims with a mere glance, leading them to an unknown fate. As the night progressed, the sounds of the storm lessened, but a new sound emerged, the sound of branches snapping under cautious feet. I froze, wondering if it could be a wild animal wandering too close to our cabin. My heart raced as I heard deliberate steps approaching the cabin. The rain started to fall again, pounding on the cabin's windows. The steps outside ceased, but my alert remained. My heart hammered as I searched for something to use as a weapon. I found a piece of firewood next to the fireplace and gripped it tightly, ready for whatever might come. Suddenly, a pale face appeared at the window, its deep-set eyes fixed on me. My blood ran cold in my veins as I recognized the figure from the legendary Wanderer. His face was partially obscured by the darkness, but I could see his eyes shining with an odd light. He seemed to be hypnotizing me, and for a moment I felt an inexplicable pull to open the door and let him in. I forced myself to look away, breaking eye contact. I knew I shouldn't invite a stranger in, especially one as sinister as he was. My breath became shallow as I wondered what he wanted. The rain continued to fall, as if hiding his steps as he circled the cabin. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice sounding braver than I felt. "What do you want?" There was no response, only the sound of the rain and the wind howling around the cabin. My heart hammered in my chest as I stood up, holding the firewood tightly. I slowly walked towards the door, determined to face whatever was out there. "I know you're there," I shouted, my voice sounding firm despite my fear. "Show yourself." My hand trembled as I turned the doorknob and flung the door open. The rain fell on me, but I barely noticed it. On the porch there was only darkness and the rain pounding. The Wanderer had disappeared. My relief was short-lived, as a sense of imminent danger still lingered. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. My heart was still racing as I wondered about the strange figure's intentions. "John, what are you doing?" Sarah's voice sounded from behind me. I turned to see her standing on the stairs, her eyes wide with sleep. "Why did you open the door?" I thought I saw something," I stammered, still dazed by the encounter. Sarah yawned and rubbed her eyes. "You probably saw an animal." she said, descending the stairs. "Don't worry, it's just the rain playing tricks on your imagination." I tried to calm my racing heart, convincing myself that she was right. I went back to the living room, where the fireplace still crackled, and sat down, trying to warm myself. Sarah joined me, wrapping herself in a blanket. "You should go to sleep," she suggested, yawning again. "It's been a long day, and tomorrow is another." I nodded, still a bit reluctant to leave the safety of the fireplace, but Sarah was right. I needed to try to rest. I got up, stretching my tense muscles, and climbed the stairs to the bedroom that Sarah and I shared. I lay in bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. The rain was still tapping on the windows, creating a soothing melody. My encounter with the Wanderer seemed like a distant dream, and I wondered if I had imagined it all. As I was about to fall asleep, I heard a soft sound coming from outside the cabin. My eyes widened in the darkness, and my heart began to race again. The sound came again, the sound of something being dragged across the floor. I froze, listening intently. Sarah's breathing beside me was calm and steady, indicating she was deeply asleep. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the shadows dancing on the walls. Then, I saw a figure moving outside the window. My body went rigid as I recognized the tall and slender figure of the Wanderer. He seemed to be looking directly at me, his eyes shining in the darkness. A wave of fear washed over me, leaving me unable to move or scream. The Wanderer raised his hand, pointing at the window. I felt an irresistible urge to open the window and let him in. My body moved on its own, as if under the control of an unknown force. As soon as the window was opened, the Wanderer smiled, revealing a disproportionately large mouth. His smile was sinister, and I felt a chill down my spine. "John!" Sarah's scream snapped me back to reality. She shook my shoulder, her eyes wide with fear. "You're scaring me. Close the window right now." Confused, I looked at the window, and then everything clicked into place. It wasn't the Wanderer. It was just the rain and shadows playing tricks on my imagination. I felt relieved, but also a bit embarrassed. Sarah gave me a concerned look, and then smiled gently. "It's okay," she said, shrugging. "I guess the story of the Wanderer got us a little paranoid. Let's try to get some sleep, all right?" I nodded, closing the window tightly. The rain continued to fall, but now it felt comforting instead of threatening. I turned onto my side, facing the wall, and tried to calm my mind. The next day, when the sun shone through the windows, the cabin felt like a completely different place. We went out to explore the forest, and I felt foolish for being so scared the night before. However, as we were heading back to the cabin, something caught my attention. An old, half-hidden tombstone among the vegetation. I approached it, brushing away leaves and cobwebs. My heart stopped when I read the inscription. "Here lies the Wanderer, friend of children, an unsolved mystery." My mind went back to the previous night, and I wondered if there was more to the legend than I thought. Perhaps there was truth to the scary stories after all. It was one of those nights when the cold wind whistled through the deserted streets, making the dry leaves dance in whirlwinds along the sidewalks. I'm Maggie, and I was curled up in my apartment, trying to study for my college finals. Solitude was my constant companion, and the dim light of the lamp created a peaceful yet somewhat intimidating atmosphere. I turned on the TV to take a break from my studying routine, looking for something that could distract my tired mind. That's when I stumbled upon a program about real-life horror stories. The introduction immediately caught my attention, presenting an intriguing narrative about a haunted house known as No End House. According to the legend, the house was a terror labyrinth, consisting of 9 rooms, each designed to challenge and terrify those who dared to enter. The stories surrounding that place were chilling, with accounts of people facing their worst phobias and experiencing paranormal phenomena. Some even suggested that the house was a portal to another dimension, where the laws of physics did not apply. I was instantly fascinated and, at the same time, a bit skeptical. I've always been drawn to scary stories, but I maintained a healthy sense of skepticism. However, There was something about No End House that intrigued me. Perhaps it was the conviction with which the interviewees spoke about their experiences or the eerie images that were displayed. That's when my boyfriend, David Parker, called. His voice sounded excited, which was unusual since he was usually calm and contained. "Maggie, you won't believe what just happened to me. I've just been challenged to enter the No End House," he said, full of enthusiasm. My heart seemed to stop for a moment upon hearing those words. I knew David well enough to know that when he decided to do something, nothing would change his mind. "David, wait," I pleaded. "I've heard stories about this place, and they're not good. People say that this house is cursed, that bad things happen in there." David laughed, trying to reassure me. "Don't worry, I can take care of myself. Plus, they're offering a $500 prize. Think of it as a paid adventure, and who knows, we might use that money for something special." I tried to argue further, but David had already hung up, eager to embark on his journey to No End House. I felt a knot in my stomach and a sense of foreboding. Scary stories and supernatural phenomena had always freaked me out. And now my boyfriend was getting involved in something that sounded like it was straight out of a horror movie. The following days were a mix of anxiety and curiosity as I awaited David to start his journey. He kept me updated on his preparations, revealing that the challenge was organized by an anonymous group that had created the house as a sort of extreme horror attraction. The rules were simple. He had to go through all 9 rooms, and if he succeeded, he would receive the cash prize. David sounded confident, but I couldn't ignore the voice in my head telling me that something would go wrong. On the day he left, I felt helpless, unable to stop him. "I'll be back before you know it," he said, smiling, trying to reassure me. The hours dragged on as I waited for news from David. My heart raced every time my phone rang, fearing the worst. On the 3rd night, I received a call. My heart stopped when I saw David's name on the screen. "Maggie." David's voice sounded weak and trembling. I made it." I went through all the rooms. It was the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced, but I survived. I felt a mix of relief and curiosity consuming me. "David, where are you?" "What happened? Tell me everything." David sighed, and I could hear the sound of his ragged breathing. "I'm somewhere outside the city. They brought me here by car, blindfolded. I don't exactly know where I am, but I'll find a way back." His words left me worried. "David, are you okay? What happened in there? Why does your voice sound like that?" David hesitated, and I could hear the conflict in his voice. I saw things, Maggie. Things I can't explain. Each room was scarier than the other. I faced my worst phobias, shadow creatures, and sounds that drove me crazy. My curiosity won, and I begged for more details. David then described each room, from the first, where he was attacked by invisible insects, to the last, where he found his doppelganger, begging not to be hurt. I was in a frenzy, Maggie. I couldn't think straight, so I stabbed him. I had to do it to get to the last room. That's where I found the letter declaring me the winner. I was shocked by David's account, imagining the terror he must have faced. "Oh my God, David. This is insane. You need to get out of there immediately. Come back home. We're right in the city center." David agreed, and his voice sounded a bit stronger. "You're right. I'll find a way back. I'm sorry if I scared you. It wasn't my intention." We said our goodbyes, and I sat there paralyzed, thinking about what David had gone through. Real scary stories had always fascinated me, but now I was living one, and the feeling was terrifying. The weeks went by, and David didn't return. I called countless times, sent messages, and even went to the police, but no one seemed to know of his whereabouts. My concern turned into despair, and I found myself immersed in a nightmare. The nights were the worst, and my mind wandered to the worst possible scenarios. I started investigating on my own, trying to find out something about No End House. I discovered that other people had also taken on the challenge, but none of them seemed to know what had happened to David. 3 weeks after his disappearance, I decided to take action. I got in my car and drove to the location where David had said the journey began. It was an old, isolated house in the woods, just like in horror stories. My heart hammered in my chest as I stepped out of the car and walked towards the door. The house seemed empty, but I could feel a sinister presence watching my movements. I entered, calling out for David, my voice echoing through the dark corridors. I heard a sound, like a distant whisper. I followed the sound, finding a partially open door. I stepped into the room and froze at what I saw. David was there, chained to a wall, his body thin and bruised. I rushed to him, my eyes filling with tears. "David, oh my God, what have they done to you?" He smiled weakly, his eyes shining with relief. "Maggie, you came to find me. I knew you would. What is going on here, David? Who did this to you?" My voice sounded furious as I searched for a way to free him. David sighed, his voice weak and trembling. "I don't know for sure. After you couldn't reach me anymore, I started investigating. I found out that this house is more than just a horror attraction. It's as if it has a life of its own, sucking people in." Horrified, I asked, "What do you mean? How can we get out of here?" David looked at me, his eyes full of despair. "I don't know if we can get out, Maggie. I think we're trapped, but you have to try. Go away. Leave while you can." My heart broke hearing his words. "I won't leave you here, David. We'll find a way out, together." The search for an exit turned into a nightmare, with each room presenting new terror. We encountered shadow creatures, sinister figures that watched us from the darkness, and deadly traps. It was as if the house were alive, testing us at every step. As we progressed through No End House, we felt that something was amiss. Who had created this house of horrors? What was the ultimate purpose behind all this psychological torture? The questions echoed in our minds, fueling our determination to find answers. "We can't stop now," I said, feeling a growing impulse within me. "We have to figure out who is behind this. There are more people involved, I know it." Maggie nodded, her eyes reflecting the same determination I felt. "We'll keep going. We need to expose whoever is responsible for all this terror. Other people might be in danger." Our journey through No End House had been transformative. We faced our fears, overcame obstacles that seemed insurmountable, and in the process developed an inner strength we didn't know we possessed. The house seemed to have a life of its own, presenting new challenges with each room we entered. But we pressed on, driven by curiosity and the desire to help other potential victims. We faced rooms that challenged our sanity, with illusions that confused our senses, and shadow creatures that seemed to emerge from our worst nightmares. With each room we overcame, we felt we were getting closer to unraveling the mystery. Finally, we caught sight of the exit. A bright light seemed to call us, promising answers and freedom. Running towards it, we felt a mix of relief and anticipation. We crossed the threshold, leaving No End House behind. The sun warmed our faces, providing a moment of peace. But we knew our journey wasn't over. There were more mysteries to unravel, more secrets hidden in the shadows. Together, Maggie and I vowed to continue seeking answers. Even if the path ahead was uncertain and dangerous, we were determined to expose the truth behind No End House and to protect other innocent people from going through what we had. Escaping No End House was just the beginning of our mission to uncover the true scary stories that were yet to come. Who was the brain behind it all? That was the question that drove us forward. It was a chilly winter night in Boston, and I, Parker, was content in my new home in the North End neighborhood. My apartment, though old, exuded a cozy charm with its creaking floors under my feet, and walls that seemed to hold stories of past eras. My neighbors were discreet, contributing to the peaceful atmosphere of the place. However, on that particular night, an unusual event broke the serenity of my refuge. I was absorbed in a book in the tranquility of my room when an uncommon sound coming from the living room caught my attention. Pausing my reading, I fell silent. Soon, I heard the sound again. Something had been knocked over. My heart raced, and an icy apprehension enveloped me. Instinctively, I grabbed the flashlight within reach and cautiously stepped out of the room. The light from the flashlight cast eerie shadows on the walls as I advanced. Step by step, the smell of old wood and dust filled the air. As I turned the corner towards the living room, I came across a disturbing scene. One of my chairs lay on the floor, and scratch marks adorned the wooden floor. There were no signs of forced entry, and the windows were tightly closed. A chill ran down my spine. How could someone have entered without leaving a trace, and why? My thoughts wandered to the possibility of it being just the wind or the quirks of an old building, but even so, an inner voice insisted that there was something more sinister afoot. The idea of being watched sent shivers down my spine. Although I had no concrete proof, I stood paralyzed, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The idea that someone or something had broken into my apartment undetected was terrifying. My heart pounded, and I felt vulnerable in my own home. I tried to rationalize the incident. Maybe it was a rat that had sneaked in and caused the ruckus. Or it could be a structural issue in the old building. But the scratch marks on the floor seemed to indicate something more deliberate. I decided to examine the apartment more carefully, starting with the kitchen. I opened the cabinets and looked under the sink, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The silence was heavy, and I could feel invisible eyes watching me. A sense of paranoia grew within me. Just as I was about to give up, I heard a sound coming from the bedroom. I ran back, my heart in my throat. The closet door was open, and my clothes seemed disturbed, as if someone had gone through them. A chill ran down my spine. I wasn't imagining things. There was something, or someone, in the apartment with me. I stood there, paralyzed, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to run away, but another part wanted to stay and face the unseen intruder. I decided I wouldn't give in to fear. I grabbed a baseball bat I kept by the bed and positioned myself at the bedroom door, ready to face whatever was in there. I stood at the entrance of the room, the baseball bat firmly held in my sweaty hands. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my temple. The darkness seemed to pulse around me, and I wondered if something was hiding in the shadows, watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I tried to calm my breathing and pushed aside the fears, preparing to face the unknown. With a quick move, I turned on the light and advanced into the room. The light revealed an empty space, the curtains gently swaying with the night breeze, but I knew I wasn't alone. "Who's there? Show yourself," I shouted, my voice sounding challenging in the silence. My eyes scanned every corner of the room, but there was no one in sight. Just as I was about to turn and leave, I heard a whisper behind me. I spun around quickly, the bat raised, but there was nothing there. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt a malevolent presence in the room. It was as if something invisible was crawling towards me, exuding an aura of pure malevolence. My entire body was on high alert, and I knew I had to get out of there. I ran out of the room, the bat still in my hand, and slammed the door shut. My heart was racing, and I felt confused and scared. What the hell was going on? I stood in the living room, my gaze nervously wandering around the apartment. My brain tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was some sort of illusion, a trick of my mind, but the scratch marks on the floor and the persistent feeling of being watched told me otherwise. I decided to investigate the building, talk to the neighbors to see if anyone else had experienced something similar. I walked down the corridors, knocking on doors, but no one seemed to be home. The building seemed strangely deserted, which only added to the sense of isolation and mystery. Just as I was about to give up, I saw an older woman exiting an apartment at the end of the hallway. She looked at me with caution, and I could see fear in her eyes. I introduced myself and told her about the strange happenings in my apartment. To my surprise, she seemed relieved that I had spoken to her. "You're not the first to report such events," she whispered, casting nervous glances to the sides. "This building has a dark history. There are rumors that a previous tenant experienced something similar and eventually disappeared without a trace. They say he was haunted by something invisible, a malevolent presence that took him away in the darkness of night. I personally think it's psychological, but who knows?" Her words hit me like a punch in the gut. Was my apartment haunted? Or was I becoming paranoid? And what happened to the previous tenant? The woman didn't know, but she advised me to leave while I could. Chilled to the bone, I went back to my apartment, packing my things in a hurry. I wouldn't stay to find out if the rumors were true. As I left, I looked back, feeling the invisible eyes of the building watching me. I had escaped something sinister, and this would be a bedtime story I'd tell for many years to come. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, You won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.